Herzlich willkommen, liebe Zuschauer, zu einer neuen Folge im Auge des Bruders mit Scott Ritter hier auf unserem YouTube-Kanal Gegenpol. Mein Name ist Monique Stegemann und in dieser Woche geht es um folgende Themen. Hallo lieber Scott, schön, dass du dir heute die Zeit nimmst. Meine erste Frage an dich.
Okay.
Laut dem russischen Verteidigungsministerium plant die Ukraine Angriffe auf das russische Kernland mit Hilfe westlicher Marschflugkörper, etwa vom Typ Storm Shadow, durchzuführen. Dabei hat nach Angaben der US-Regierung der ukrainische Präsident Wladimir Selenskij immer wieder versichert, dass es dazu nicht kommen werde. Wie ernst kann man Selenskijs Versprechen an die westlichen Verbündeten nehmen, wenn deutschen Berichten zufolge Kiew trotz Warnungen der CIA nicht davor zurückgeschreckt ist, einen Terroranschlag gegen Nord Stream zu verüben?
Well, I mean, let's just start with the issue about Nord Stream. I think one has to take the current round of press reporting that Ukraine was behind the attack with a grain of salt, especially when one of the principal sources of information used to sustain this narrative is the CIA. The CIA lies for a living, and I've always tried to remind people that the CIA's job is not to inform the public. They're not a public relations agency. They don't like to discuss what they really do. So if the CIA is talking, it's because there's a political objective behind it, usually to disinform the public. So I continue to be a fan of Seymour Hersh's original report that said that the United States is behind the attack on Nord Stream, not the Ukrainians. But be that as it may, we don't have to look at Nord Stream. We just have to reflect on what happened today. The Ukrainian government used Storm Shadow missiles to take out a bridge connecting Crimea with Kherson. This is an attack against Russian infrastructure related to Crimea. It's the very kind of attack that Zelensky said he wouldn't consider, but he has now done. So once again, believe the Russians, don't believe the Ukrainians, don't trust the West. And now Ukraine will have to pay the price. And, the Russians have said that they will view any attack against Crimea or Russia with these Western-provided weapons not only as proof positive that the parties that supplied the weapons, in this case, Great Britain and the United States, are now parties to the conflict, therefore legally at war with Russia. What was the purpose of providing Storm Shadow? Why does Ukraine need a long-range cruise missile if the West says, oh, but we don't want them to strike Crimea or Russia? Then give them a short-range cruise missile. You gave them a long-range cruise missile because you knew very well what they were going to do because you've been directing them. And this is also the big lie that somehow Ukraine is in charge and responsible. No. The weapons are provided for a strategic purpose, and that strategic purpose is linked to specific targets, and those targets are selected by the West. So, this just represents the not so gradual transition of this conflict away from being a Russian-Ukrainian conflict into being a general war between Russia and NATO. And this is where I'd ask people to reflect on an article written by Sergei Karaganov, a Russian academic and strategic thinker, just published a article in a journal, I think, Russian and Global Affairs, where he talks about nuclear weapons. And this is a man who has some influence, and his thinking, is linked to mainstream Russian thinking. And he's now saying, because of this reality that the West is at war with Russia, it's time for Russia to reconsider its nuclear doctrine and embrace preemptive nuclear war. And therefore, if the West is going to continue to support Ukraine and supply Ukraine with the means to attack Russia, that Russia should use nuclear weapons preemptively against NATO nations. Germany, you're a NATO nation. Now, in his article, he speaks about striking Poznan because he postulates the hypothetical that, let's say, the Russians go ahead and strike Poznan with a nuclear weapon. The American president will be confronted with the decision, do I trade Boston for Poznan? And the answer the Russians believe is that the president won't be willing to trade American cities for a Polish city or a German city. And this is something that Europe needs to wake up to, the real possibility of your imminent nuclear demise, the stupidity of the European nations, of the German government, and frankly speaking, the passivity of the German people and the European people in the face of this suicidal desire to support Ukraine with all possible means in this conflict against Russia. There are consequences, and the consequences will probably be your death. Now, if you want to die, that's your business. I don't care. But understand that a nuclear conflict brings in the possibility of a nuclear expanding to America. And now I'm dying because of your stupidity. And that's where I draw the line. People ask me all the time, why am I so hostile against the German people? Because the German people are trying to kill me, trying to kill my family, trying to destroy my nation with their passivity and their stupidity. Start thinking, people. Put on your thinking caps and start demanding that your government does the right thing.
Sollte die Ukraine dennoch mit Raketen russisches Territorium angreifen, warnt der Kreml vor einer Eskalation des Konflikts mit Angriffen auf ukrainische Entscheidungszentren. Jetzt gibt es sehr viele Kommentatoren in Russland, aber auch in den USA, die sich die Frage stellen, warum hat Moskau bislang diese ukrainischen Entscheidungszentren verschont? Bei den US-Kriegen sind das ja eigentlich immer die ersten Ziele gewesen, die man versucht hat auszuschalten. Wie denkst du darüber?
Well, I think one of the interesting things in examining this conflict, I was on a video conference with a group of analysts, journalists, reporters, and I made a reference to the special military operation, and somebody chimed in on the chat aspect of, "What's that? I don't speak Putin." I mean, it's basically an attack on me, saying that somehow by using the term special military operation, I've embraced the Russian point of view. But all the person did is show their ignorance of the situation, because this isn't a war. This is a special military operation. You are right to point out that if the United States was waging a war against a nation, for instance, like Iraq, we take out their command centers. I can tell you with absolute certainty, because I was involved in it in Operation Desert Storm in 1991, we were trying to kill Saddam Hussein. We were trying to eliminate Saddam Hussein's leadership. We struck every place in Baghdad and around Iraq that we thought Saddam Hussein might be in. I was tasked with killing Saddam during a short period of time to come up with targets that met a specific piece of intelligence where Saddam would be. So I can tell you straight up, we tried to kill him. If Russia was at war with Ukraine, Zelensky would be dead, because they would have tried to kill him and they would have had better success than we did against Saddam. Zaluzhny would be dead. The Minister of Defense would be dead. Every senior Ukrainian official would be dead. Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, would be dead. They would all die because they are legitimate command and control targets, and the Russians would strike them. Why hasn't Russia struck them? Well, again, to the analyst who says I speak Putin, you better learn to speak Putin. Everybody out there needs to learn to speak Putin, because if you did, you'd understand what's going on here. The West continues to pretend that the decision to walk away from the Minsk Accords by Angela Merkel, a German chancellor, by Francois Hollande, a French president, and by Petro Poroshenko, a NATO-backed Ukrainian president, never happened. What are you talking about? It was the Russians that sabotaged Minsk. No, it was the West. It was the Ukrainians using diplomacy as a shield to buy time to build up a Ukrainian military. Now, the Russians did everything to try and prevent this war. We now have the Ukrainians admitting that right up until the very end, Russia was meeting with the Ukrainians to try and stop this war, come up with a formula that could prevent this war from happening. Yermak, the advisor to Zelensky, and brags about the fact that we fooled the Russians up until the very end, and we just bought more time, etc. the Russians tried to get NATO and the United States to buy into a diplomatic solution. In December of 2021, they put draft treaties forward on that. Even when the Russian forces came in, the Russians weren't there to occupy Ukraine. The purpose of the special military operation was to get Ukraine to the negotiating table. Remember, Russia was negotiating with Ukraine right up to the beginning of the conflict. Ukraine walked away. The purpose of the special military operation was to get the Ukrainians back to the negotiating table. And they succeeded. 3 rounds of negotiation in Gomel in Belarus, leading to a concluding meeting scheduled on 1 April in Istanbul, where there was going to be a draft treaty considered. Now, many in the West have contended that never happened. But there was a recent trip to St. Petersburg by an African delegation promoting a peace plan. And Putin sat down and showed everybody the draft treaty, the one that has the signature of the Ukrainians saying, we agree to this. Now, we also have the Ukrainians bragging about how they fooled the Russians, because what did they get? By signing that, the Russians then carried out a confidence building measure, a good faith gesture by voluntarily withdrawing their troops from around Kiev, around Sumy and other areas, pulling them back. And the Ukrainians then said, thank you very much. We're walking away from the agreement, but we're going to go move into these territories as well. This is what the Russians have been trying to achieve, a diplomatic solution. The special military operation has always been about achieving a negotiated settlement. Now, who do you negotiate with? Dead people or living people? And is it better to negotiate with people you have a record of dealing with, or new people who you don't know? So why has Russia not taken out the decision-making centers? Because Russia has always held out hopes that the Ukrainians would come to their senses and send the negotiating team that Russia knew back to the table so Russia could resume discussions, and that the negotiating team would be representing Ukrainian officials who were familiar with the negotiations already, so you wouldn't have to relearn everything. That's why. So when Ukraine carries out these attacks, what Ukraine is saying is we have no interest in a negotiated settlement to this conflict, which means that there's no reason for Russians to keep these people alive anymore. And now Russia will kill them. Not Zelensky, because he's the head of state. But if Ukrainians don't want to negotiate, they have there's no use for them in the world anymore from the Russian perspective. And so Russia will take them out. But this is why it's taken so long, because the Russians don't want a war. They've always wanted peace. They've always wanted a negotiated settlement, but it's Ukraine and the collective West that have sought to take this path towards war. So if you want war, there's that old saying, be careful what you ask for, because you just might get it. The Ukrainians are asking for war. I think they're going to get it.
Momentan wird sehr viel über die ukrainische Gegenoffensive gesprochen. Kleinere Vorstöße in die sogenannte Graue Zone werden als großer Erfolg gewertet. Dabei sind die ukrainischen Streitkräfte auch nach 2 Wochen noch nicht bis zur ersten Verteidigungslinie der Russen vorgedrungen. Woran liegt das? Und kannst du vielleicht für unsere Zuschauer erklären, was aus militärischer Sicht eine Graue Zone ist?
Well, let's just start off with what Russia has done since September, October of last year. Again, remember that the original Russian military posture in Ukraine was not designed to occupy territory, hold on to territory. It was designed to create a presence that would achieve a negotiated settlement. And we know that the Russians were willing, as of 1 April, to return Kherson, return Zaporizhia to Ukrainian control, to return all the territories around Kharkov to Ukrainian control. That the Russians, what they insisted on is that Lugansk and Donetsk be independent of Ukraine, that Ukraine would not be allowed to govern these territories given the history that took place during 8 years of Minsk, and that Crimea would be Russian. But their posture was not that of an occupier. But after the referendums that were held in the fall of 2022, These territories have become Russian from a Russian perspective, legally. The Constitution and everything has kicked in. And so what Russia has done is built defenses to defend these territories. These defensive lines are built doctrinally. The Russians have always specialized in defensive warfare, dating back to Soviet times. With limited exceptions, the Soviet strategy was always to absorb a NATO attack and then carry out a massive counterattack. The Russian doctrine was that way, but it was modified after the lessons learned from the Ukrainian conflict. The man who modified it was a Russian general, Colonel General Alexander Romanchuk. He had combat experience as the deputy commander of the 58th Army, Southern Military District. And he came away from the early phases of the fighting saying we have to change because of technology. We have to adapt our doctrine. So he rewrote the Russian defensive doctrine. And they sent him to the Combined Arms Academy, sort of the senior general staff academy, where he wrote this doctrine, staffed it around, got it perfected, published it. And the Russians used his concepts to build their defense. They also trained their forces to operate from these defensive positions doctrinally, which means there's three lines of defense: the contact line, basically the steel line, and then the counterattack line. The contact line is designed to absorb the enemy attack. In front of the contact line, you have this gray zone, they call it, but it's where flexible defense takes place. It's where the obstacle belts are, the minefields, the dragon's teeth, trenches, screening forces. Now, the purpose of this initial area, this contact area, isn't to hold fast. It's designed to give way, to bring the enemy in to that first line of defense where you hammer them. And then if they break that first line of defense, remember, the first line of defense is designed to be broken. The idea is to channelize the attack in to a specific area where it breaks, and now they move in and they're further struck before they hit the line of steel, the second line of defense, which is not designed to be broken. It's going to hold fast, hold. And then from the third line of defense, the counterattacking force responds to push them back. That is the way it's done doctrinally. Romanchuk not only designed this, he oversaw its construction, and he's in command right now. Understand, the man that conceived this, who built it, is in command of it. So this is like having the guy who designs a race car being, the head of the racing team. He knows everything about that racing car, everything. Okay, so there's that. That's the Russian defense. Breaching a fortified defensive position is the most difficult military mission in the world. There's nothing harder. You have an enemy dug in prepared defenses, and your job is to breach them, to go through and take them out. It's extraordinarily difficult. And I speak of personal knowledge here because in 1990, I helped design the Marine Corps breach of Iraqi defensive positions. I gamed it out on a supercomputer and wrote up the plan that was sent to the Marines, and they used it, and it worked like a charm. Why I bring that up, the role of computer simulation. Germans, you have this wonderful thing called Cora. It's a computer game that the German Bundeswehr has come up with, and NATO has adapted it. And you were kind enough to let the Ukrainians have access to Cora in planning their attack. But were you really kind? Because you see, Germans, I'm talking to the German people now, your military lied to the Ukrainians. They deceived them. Because when you're going to carry out a breaching assault of a prepared defensive position, doctrinally, things have to occur. There's a mnemonic that's used, I think it's Sora, but the first letter is an S. Ask any German Bundeswehr professional officer, what does that S stand for? And he will tell you suppression. And that suppression is the most important aspect of any part of this assault. What suppression means is that as the assault forces go through the obstacle barrier, the minefields that have to be cleaned out of the way. That's very dangerous, laborious work. Enemy capabilities that could interdict this and disrupt this must be suppressed. So that means that enemy air forces must be pushed out of the area, which means you must have air power capable of doing that. And if you don't have the airplanes to do it, you must be able to project an air defense umbrella over the battlefield that keeps enemy helicopters and enemy aircraft at bay. You also must be able to suppress the artillery fires of your opponents so that they can't fire in on you. You must be able to suppress their command and control through electronic warfare so there can be no coordination, no communication. That's suppression. So you can't just talk about taking a unit and saying, that's your primary axis of advance, move. It has to be done in concert with all of the suppression. CORA is built to do that. There are sub-models in CORA that talk about everything I just said, to war game out all of this, and it's all done together to create this unified approach to war. And it works good if all of the units are available, they're working together, etc. I want to ask the Germans, what Ukrainian air power was factored into the CORA model? And the answer is none. So how are you suppressing Russian air power? The answer is we didn't. What Ukrainian air defense was factored into your planning assumptions? Oh, we didn't plan it. Why not? Well, they don't have an air defense. So how are you going to suppress the Russian helicopters? Oh, we weren't. Or what Ukrainian electronic warfare was factored in? Well, very little because they don't have much. So you weren't going to disrupt Russian communications. No, we weren't. What about the Russian artillery? They have a 10-to-1 advantage over you. How are you going to suppress Russian artillery? Oh, well, we didn't factor that in. What did you do? And now here's where the Germans come in, and they have to tell the truth. Well, the way we did it with CORA is because we couldn't suppress. We just built in an assumption that if we hit the Russians in this one spot, that the Russian troops would drop their weapons and run away. That was the assumption. That forget all of the every other things. Forget that Colonel General Alexander Romanchuk designed this. Forget the Russians had 8 months to train their troops, to prepare their troops, to assemble the forces necessary to make this defensive position virtually undefeatable. Forget that. You're telling the Ukrainians, if you simply advance in this direction, the Russians will drop their weapons and run away. And that's the God's honest truth. That's what was programmed in. But that's not the worst part of this, you see, because the Ukrainian forces that were sent there couldn't do the job no matter what. And the Germans knew this. What would the German people think if this was a German army that had been unleashed on the Russian defensive positions and you suffered 10,000 dead in a week and a half? Would there be hearings in the Bundestag? I think the answer would be yes. No German parliamentarian, no German citizen would allow the German military to treat the German soldiers the way NATO treated the Ukrainian soldiers. This was a suicide mission from the very beginning. So here's the other thing I have to ask the esteemed German public. If you claim to care about Ukraine, and I'm sure there's some of you who do, why do you tolerate this? Do you love Ukraine so much that you're willing to let the German government, the German army, NATO murder tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers? Because that's what's happened. They were murdered. They never had a chance, and NATO knew it. The German military knew it. Everybody knew it, except those poor Ukrainians who were misled into believing that if they just did what their NATO friends told them to do, that they could win, that they had a chance. Friends, they're NATO friends, they're NATO allies, they're NATO colleagues. Germany, you're a friend to nobody. You're as guilty as the Americans are on this one. I've always condemned the Americans for treating the Ukrainians as disposable assets, but I never thought that I would have to say the same thing about Germany. But you helped plan this attack. You helped prepare them. You're responsible. The blood of these Ukrainians is on your hands. What are you going to do about it?
Themenwechsel. Lass uns über US-Präsident Joe Biden sprechen. Er irrt orientierungslos umher. Er fällt vom Podium, er beendet seine Rede mit God Save the Queen. Jüngst behauptete das Weiße Haus, Biden erfreue sich bester Gesundheit. Offensichtlich ist das aber nicht so. Zu welchem Zweck setzen die US-Eliten so lange auf Biden? Und für dich als US-Bürger, was bedeutet es, wenn der US-Präsident statt God Save America, God Save the Queen sagt?
Well, it's curious that you mentioned history. The interesting thing about history is that in order for it to have any relevance, you have to be knowledgeable of it. July 4th is coming up. It's American independence celebration. July 4th, 1776, when the Continental Congress declared independence from the British royal crown. Declaration of Independence, I believe, is one of the greatest documents in modern history. It's up there with the Constitution as foundational documents to define who we are and what we are as a nation, that being Americans. But we don't understand that. I mean, very few Americans have actually read the Declaration of Independence, have absorbed what it meant to have these men sign their names to a document that basically confessed treason, taking a decision to set forth on a journey that had no guaranteed outcome. Indeed, should they fail, they would all die and their families would suffer greatly. The courage that it took to do this, the courage of conviction, what it meant to be a founding father of America. Instead today, and again, I don't want to go too far down the path, but for instance, here in Albany, we just took down the statue of Philip Schuyler. Philip Schuyler was an American patriot who played a very important role, not only in defeating British forces in the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, but also helped create the state of New York as part of the early colonial states, and then as a founding state of the American Republic. But we took down his statue because Philip Schuyler was a slave owner. You see, he owned about 40 slaves. And I'm not condoning slave ownership. I think America has shown that it was wrong. We fought a civil war in part to abolish slavery. But Philip Schuyler was one of those founding fathers, and those founding fathers put together a constitution that, when it was signed, allowed slavery. That's a harsh reality of America, a harsh reality of America. But you can't condemn the man because he was part of a system that recognized this horrific concept of slavery. What you can do is understand the circumstances of his existence, what the role slavery played at that time, and then try and figure out what caused America to gravitate from a point where, our founding fathers thought that slavery was justified to the point where we fought a civil war to abolish slavery. And then the struggles that we've had ever since with integrating African Americans into our society, the Jim Crow era, continued troubles with civil rights and things of that nature, Black Lives Matter. This is all linked. It's all linked, but you don't get an understanding by erasing history, by removing the statue, by refusing to engage in the subject matter. And I bring this up to show that history is extraordinarily complicated. And if you don't understand it, if you forget it, then you're doomed to be wandering the present world without a compass, without a map. You're just wandering. You don't know what you're doing. So you made a lighthearted joke about, where are we with our, understanding the revolution? We don't know the revolution. We don't understand it. Very few Americans tour revolutionary battlefields. Very few Americans go to the museums to dig deeper or read the books necessary to understand. And so, as a result, we wander the present without a compass, or GPS, I guess we would use today because it's the modern era. But we're just wandering around. So when the president makes a statement like that, there isn't the deep reflection of, wow, it's ha 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 ha. Or if you're anti-Biden, it's just automatically the man's senile, the man's this. But it doesn't touch upon the larger picture, which is Americans don't know their history. And if we don't know our history, we don't know ourselves. We don't know who we are, what we are, and therefore we really don't know what it is we're defending or what we stand for. So it's a serious problem. Look, I'm going to be 62 next month. Newsflash. And I can guarantee you that there's days when I make too sharp of a left turn and I stumble. Um, or I try to run like I did 40 years ago and I can't. So I am the last person in the world that's going to fling vindictive against a person of a certain age because their body isn't cooperating. That happens, and we shouldn't make fun of it because it's a reality of life. But we have to recognize that it is a reality of life, and that as an individual approaches 80, Mother Nature is sending out a message that says you shouldn't be playing football, you shouldn't be doing what your body can't do anymore. And it's not just the physical aspect. Look, Seymour Hersh, noted journalist, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, good friend of mine, he's 85. Now that son of a gun is out there playing tennis. And he would beat me playing tennis. There's just no doubt about it. 85-year-old man would beat me playing tennis. We play golf. I have to admit, he beats me. So here's a guy who is 85, but he has maintained a modicum of physical fitness. And anybody who reads what he is writing can see his brain is as sharp today as it's ever been. Will Sy admit that he gets tired on occasion, that he can't play as long and as hard as he used to sports, and when he writes that he has to take breaks because he gets tired? Yes. Why? He's 85 years old. Okay, that happens. I tried to watch Guardians of the Galaxy 2 last night, and I fell asleep. I love this movie. Okay, I fell asleep because I'm almost 62 years old, and I had a long, hard day, and my eyes closed. It happens. So that's not what we're talking about here, though. We're talking about a president whose brain has stopped functioning properly. I'm not making fun of the physical things. I mean, I don't like Joe Biden, and I easily could go that route, but I won't because it's wrong. Okay. Physical diminishment. Look, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president of the United States and he had polio. He was in a wheelchair. So let's stop talking about physical diminishment as being that which defines somebody. John F. Kennedy had to fake it to make it, meaning in order to walk around and act like he was Mr. Stud, he had to get injections in his back because he had such debilitating physical problems. You don't have to be a physical stud to be the commander in chief of the United States of America, but your brain has to work. And Joe Biden's brain doesn't work. And this is where it gets dangerous. Look, even when his brain functioned at the height of his capabilities, when he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, his brain, although fully functional, produced garbage. This is a man who, Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense, has rightly pointed out, has been wrong about every major national security issue in his adult life. Joe Biden has been right about anything. He's been wrong about everything. And that's when his brain worked. Now his brain doesn't work. And here's the risk. Here's the danger. The other day, he was with fundraisers. And we are in a very dangerous situation. We've touched upon this earlier about the potential of nuclear conflict. And Joe Biden is talking to these fundraisers, saying, I've warned everybody, nuclear war is real. The threat of nuclear war is real. Putin is a danger. It's real. And that's the mindset of the commander in chief. A scared little puppy, confused about the facts that have been put in front of him, and he's afraid. I have a friend whose father was a police officer, and he responded to a domestic situation, husband and wife fighting. A police officer had responded before him and had his gun out and was pointing it at both people. And the superior officer came in and said, put your gun away, leave, and then talked his way through and resolved the issue so there was no violence at that point in time. But he went and he fired the police officer. And the police officer said, why? He said, because you have a gun. And if the reason for you pulling that gun out is because you're afraid, that I don't want you as a police officer. I can't have a man who is afraid holding a gun pointing it at civilians. That's a dangerous situation. Joe Biden is that police officer. He's scared. He's confused. He doesn't understand what's going on, but he holds a very big gun in his hand. And that gun is the American nuclear arsenal. And so when you have Joe Biden saying things like the nuclear threat is real, Putin is a threat, he may use nuclear weapons, that means that Joe Biden might feel the need to pull the trigger first. And this is where it gets scary. We can make fun of Joe Biden all we want. And believe me, we're in the political silly season of America where the Republicans are just going to do that. Joe Biden's opponents are going to do that, but we need to be bigger than that. We need to be adults. We need to step back and look at this thing responsibly. And no matter what you think of Joe Biden right now, and again, let's not pick on his physical limitations. The fact of the matter is, the American president is a man of diminished mental capacity, and this is an extraordinarily dangerous thing. And it's something that it's not just something that the American people need to consider going into this 2024 election, but American elected representatives need to consider when deciding whether or not to consider constitutional remedies. If the president is no longer capable of doing the job from a mental perspective, there are constitutional remedies to this. But it's also something that America's European allies must consider, that American policy today is being directed by a man of limited mental capacity, and maybe Germany and Europe and NATO shouldn't be too willing to sign on to these things. They should ask more questions. They should query their respective counterparts more deeply about the mechanisms that went into place that were in place to recommend these policies, to ensure that Europe is not being guided by someone with clearly diminished mental capability.
Am Mittwoch hat Biden den chinesischen Präsidenten Xi Jinping als Diktator bezeichnet. Nur 2 Tage nach der großen Show von US-Außenminister Antony Blinken in Peking, die scheinbar für eine Auflockerung der bilateralen Beziehungen sorgen sollte, befinden sich diese nun erneut auf einem Tiefpunkt. War das nur ein Unfall Bidens, ein freudscher Versprecher sozusagen? Oder steckt eine Strategie hinter dem respektlosen Auftreten der USA gegenüber der Volksrepublik China? Verfolgen die USA überhaupt eine Strategie mit ihrer exzessiven Aufrüstung Taiwans und der beständigen Provokation Chinas?
Well, I think we just touched upon Joe Biden and diminished mental capacity, so I think we can eliminate the notion that this comment he made, which by the way was at a fundraiser. It wasn't an official comment. He didn't make it on a podium addressing the American people. This was a throwaway comment to funders, which I think is more indicative of what passes for legitimate thought process on the part of the president. We know that politicians all lie, and that when their lips move, you understand that they are lying, because they aren't saying things they believe; they're saying things that they believe you want to hear. But in a more intimate environment, people sometimes let their guard down, and especially people of limited mental capacity, they tend to default to their core beliefs. And so when Joe Biden calls Xi Jinping a dictator, he believes it. That's what he believes. Now, the U.S. government, of course, is not supposed to give voice to this to the belief. I mean, American politicians aren't supposed to be guided by what they believe in, but by what's best for the United States, which is why Antony Blinken went to Beijing. He didn't go to Beijing because he wanted to go to Beijing. He went to Beijing because he had to go to Beijing, because the United States has maneuvered itself into a corner on China where the only outcome was going to be military violence. And the United States is not in a position to prevail in that conflict. The harm that would be done to American national security interests is overwhelming. And so Blinken had to go and basically swallow his pride and try and make good with China, begin that process. So the last thing Blinken needed was a senile old man who spout off at the mouth, in a fundraiser, and then have that be leaked to the press about Xi Jinping being a dictator. Look, the Chinese are a very mature, responsible nation. And while they will make political hay out of this, and they already have, they've condemned the president's remarks. Strategically, China is going to continue to take advantage of the new American posture of de-emphasizing Taiwanese independence, and in doing so, de-emphasizing the military aspect of the U.S.-Taiwanese relationship. While Blinken has said that if China attacks Taiwan, America will come to the defense of Taiwan. What Blinken's actually doing right now is creating the conditions that, make it virtually impossible for China and Taiwan to go to war, because the United States is backing away from its more aggressive stance. And one of the reasons why Blinken is doing this is because of the political reality that exists in Taiwan. Taiwan will have a national election in November of 2024, and the incumbent president and her party will more than likely not win. They will be replaced by the Kuomintang party, which has already indicated that it has no desire to pursue a path of independence. Indeed, it's taking the opposite tack to work with Communist China, with the Chinese mainland, to further integrate Taiwan and China together towards hopefully a political resolution to this issue. The United States has to make sure that it is not caught out if it continues its current policy track of supporting independence and militarizing. On November 2024, with this new party coming in, the Kuomintang party coming in, the United States will be totally isolated, because we'll have put all our eggs in one basket, and that basket has been pushed off the table and the eggs are broken. We need to back off and create a policy neutral stance about Taiwan, so that when the Kuomintang wins, we are still considered to be a power that has to be factored into their policymaking. We'll still have a seat at the table. And so that's what Blinken is doing, is trying to get America into sort of a policy neutral position in anticipation of deep and meaningful political change in Taiwan. The problem is this requires a modicum of cognitive thinking, and that's something that our commander-in-chief is clearly incapable of doing. And the proof of that is, of course, his very impolitic statement about the Xi Jinping being a dictator.
Vielen Dank, Scott, für die aufschlussreichen Erklärungen.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
Danke für deine Zeit. Bis nächste Woche.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Liebe Zuschauer, wie immer, herzlichen Dank fürs Zusehen. Wenn euch das Video gefallen hat, teilt es breit in den sozialen Medien. Abonniert eben noch unseren Kanal Gegenpol. Wir haben neben Scott Ritter viele weitere spannende Berichte und Analysen. Bis dahin, bis nächste Woche. Tschüss.